yes, that's you, who multiply value to others. And today, I am, as I say often, but I really mean it today. Because today I am so excited because I bring you live into a room in Chicago with some incredible, incredible leaders. And in this room, yes, go right ahead. Podcast listeners and viewers, I have a feeling now that I've met this group and been with this group for a few minutes before we started recording, that's not the last time you're going to hear from them. They are in the room to learn and grow, but to let the world know they're excited about growing. And that's you too. Our podcast listeners, week in and week out, 31 million times now has tuned in and made this podcast exactly that. A podcast that'll add value to leaders who multiply value to others. Now, today I'm joined by no stranger to our podcast family. In fact, Don, I don't know if you know this, but you have appeared on the podcast outside of John Maxwell and me. You've appeared more than anyone else.
Wow.
Don's first appearance was with John and I talking about the course, Journey to Greatness. By the way, we're going to put all of these in the show notes because I promise you, you're going to want to go back and listen to it. So Journey to Greatness. Then you came on with Kyle Carpenter. Remember that?
That was special.
Brilliant podcast. What a incredible American that you wrote a story about. And then you came on again for you and John to talk about John Wooden. You have been mentored just like John Maxwell on John Wooden. And by the way, if you've listened to this podcast more than 2 episodes, John Maxwell quotes John Wooden more than any other human being in his life. And of course, you had that same experience. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Don, I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, but Don is the host of the Corporate Competitor podcast. You're 11-time New York Times best-selling author. Can somebody give it up for 11 times? You're a leadership expert, executive coach, a Maxwell Leadership thought leader, an associate editor for many years for Sports Illustrated, not to mention, as John Maxwell says, and I agree, one of the best storytellers you will ever meet. Yeah. You will get to see that today on the podcast. So since we're in Chicago today, Don, I thought, and you did this. By the way, I got to give a shout out to Will, your son, who is in the room with us. You and Will came up from Florida to Chicago, not because this is the best audience in the world, although it is. But you came because you did an incredible story with a great leadership example, David Ross, who is the manager of the Chicago Cubs. And so, Don, we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but it is so good to have you again on the podcast.
Mark, so great. I love the opportunity anytime to invest deeper into the Maxwell Leadership family. It is, and that is exactly what it is, family, right? Awesome.
Yeah. So if you are a regular podcast listener, you want to tune in today and come into the room with us here in Chicago, go to Maxwell Podcast on YouTube. You can go to Maxwell Podcast /YouTube. You'll be able to take it in visually as well as audibly. And by the way, if you like the fill in the blank notes, you want to take some notes, you can go to maxwellpodcast.com /teammate. Don, I'm ready to go.
Let's do it.
Let's talk a little bit about, just give me some content from this book, Teammate. This is the book, again, it'll be in your show notes, but this is the book you did with David Ross. And tell me, what does every leader need?
Well, I will tell you, the fascinating thing about this book was that so David Ross, ironically, I live in Tallahassee, Florida, as you noted, and David Ross also lives in Tallahassee, Florida, right? Randomly, one day, he and I are on an airplane together, and David says, you've written a book with Walter Payton, which I did. I lived with Walter for the last few weeks of his life and wrote his autobiography. He says, you've written a book with Michael Jordan, which I did during Make-A-Wish. He said, you need the next great Chicago athlete. And I said, David, here's the problem. You're a backup catcher for the Chicago Cubs, the worst team in the history of baseball. Why would I do a book with the backup catcher from the Cubs? And he says, you don't know my story. He said, let me tell you. And what I grew to understand, and the reason we did the book, which we started the year before the Cubs won the World Series. Talk about random, right? No one believed the Cubs could win a World Series. But the story was that David had lost his career halfway through. He was 8 years in, and he got he got cut from a team in Cincinnati because he was a bad teammate, because he wasn't someone who made other people better. And wow. in that experience, one of the things that he learned was that if he could learn how to make other people better, if he could be a great teammate, he might have a greater future in the game of baseball. He actually committed himself to that. He went to Atlanta, to the Braves, opened up the whiteboard, started pulling everybody in who came through the locker room and asked them, tell me about the greatest teammate you ever had. Give me 3 words to describe that teammate. And he built himself a list of what it meant to become a great teammate. And every day before he took the field, he checked the boxes to say, I'm gonna be a teammate that will make others better, whether I play or not. Wow. And what he learned was that you can be invaluable without ever being most valuable. You could become invaluable in your organization without ever being the best in your team. And it's funny, I was talking to John one day at breakfast up in Washington, D.C., and he asked me what I was working on, and I was working on this book, and I used that phrase, invaluable without ever being most valuable. And John Maxwell, that guy's a master learner. He stopped me. He pulls out his iPad and he's like, and I said, what are you doing? He goes, that's a line I'm using in the future. Right? He goes, I don't care if you use it in your book or not, but I'm using that line because John's such a veteran learner. But the idea is that David would teach us that we can become special in any organization that we choose to join if we elect to make other people better. He built a list, made that his checklist every day. And over the course of the next several years, he didn't just become a great teammate. He became one of the most valuable players in baseball. Other teams wanted him because he wasn't a great player, but he made the locker room better. He made the environment better. And as a result, he ended up getting the chance to win 2 World Series, one in Boston and one here. And when the 7th game of the World Series was played here in Cleveland, and the Cubs won that series, the game ended, and the player that the other players carried off the field on their shoulder was a backup catcher named David Ross, because he made other people better.
Mic drop, but we're not ending the podcast, so don't go there. But Don, in this room and podcast family, I wish you could be in the room with us in Chicago, but the number of most valuable players, people that are the most valuable to the team that's even in this room. This is why we're doing this city tour. And our podcast family, you've had to listen to us talk about these city tours and feel like you're missing out. But I got to meet just a few moments ago before we started recording some of the people that have truly given me energy to do what I do on difficult travel seasons and difficult seasons and I want to come down there and carry you off the field on my shoulders.
And when he does, let's film it.
Yeah, let's film it.
Let's get some video.
I might not take you far, but at least it'd be good. Hey, let's talk a little bit more about David Ross. So in your opinion, what was the leadership quality that David possessed so well throughout his journey that you highlighted in the book?
I think the thing that he was just a learner, right? He was willing to admit, think about it, you get fired because you're a bad teammate, which he did. And instead of saying, well, it's the coach's, it's the manager's fault, it's someone else's fault, he actually owned it. He said, you know what? If I'm gonna repair myself from this moment, it's gonna be on me. And so he took ownership of where he was and what he was doing wrong to make a better future for himself. And as a result, as I said, got to win 2 World Series, right? We actually had him at Exchange several years ago. And it's funny because he shows up and John wanted to see a World Series ring, and David just had a couple of them in his backpack, just travel with a couple of World Series rings. But he knew that he couldn't blame others for his failings. He needed to own them, and he needed to repair himself, and he set out to do it by learning from other people. And the ability to ask great questions, to take the answers and improve yourself. I mean, that's what this room is all about. That's what the Maxwell Leadership family is all about. It is doing exactly that.
Well, and I'm going to come back and ask you a follow-up question on it, but I get asked a lot, traveling the world, saying, okay, what do you look for in a leader? What is it that you admire the most, or what quality do you try to unearth in the interview process? And it's exactly what you're saying. How coachable are they? How much are they willing to learn? I ask this question all the time, podcast family. When is the last time you learned something for the first time? And what was it? And I'll sit in an interview and I'll say, when was the last time you learned something for the first time? And what was it? Now, I used to say, when was the last time you learned something for the first time? They'd catch on. They go, yesterday. But when I said, and what was it? There's this pause, because it's so hard for a leader at the top of her or his game to take time to learn something else. Why do you think it's so hard for leaders how come leaders struggle so much to have this posture of learning?
Because I think there's a sense that if I'm in a learning posture, it's because I have a weakness, right? I have a hole that I need to fill. Mm-hmm. And most of us don't want to acknowledge the hole, right? Most of us want to believe we are whole. And the truth is that all of us, there's a reason they're called blind spots, right? All of us have them, and each of us need to seek someone. And sometimes it takes a traumatic moment, like losing your job, as David did, to realize the hole and the need and to go fill it.
Yeah, I so agree with that. All right, so you've interviewed countless other successful leaders. You talked a little bit before we started recording about some of the athletes that you have been able to interview and highlight in your career. Maybe you won't even tell a couple of those stories, but what are the common traits or the common practices that you've observed in some of these incredible high-performing individuals?
Probably the number one trait that really it would surprise people is that the better they are, the more humble they are. The better they are, the more they realize, the more self-aware they are, and the ability to want to try to continue to grow. We were talking about it before we got started here, that we're sitting here at Willow Creek, and just literally less than 5 miles away, maybe one of the big moments in my career occurred when